Now, with the repeal of the Townshend duties, you see a major victory had by the colonials. So that's two major victories: the repeal of the Stamp Act earlier, and now the repeal of the Townshend duties. And therefore, you see kind of a return to more peaceful times and again a rise in prosperity. But that would last very briefly. And the Tea Act of 1773 would again spark feelings of colonial revolt. Now, just to foreshadow things to come here, the colonial response is actually going to be picked up a notch, so to say. It will be even more defiant than earlier responses to the Stamp Act and to the Townshend duties. And what that's going to do is cause Parliament to get fed up with the colonials and to put their foot down, so to say. They will draw a hard line and exact some punitive measures upon the colonies, specifically Boston at first. All right, so before we discuss that, however, let's discuss why the Tea Act was passed. And it was passed because an important economic institution was at that time faltering, and that's the East India Company. Okay, just as it sounds, it was a chartered company, but it was involved in Asia, right? In India itself, the nation of India. And by this time, India was now a colony of the English Empire, right? I did mention in the beginning of this course that India, together with China, were the most wealthiest parts of the world during the 1500s. And that's still the case in the 1700s. There's a lot of valuable spices and so forth, and textiles also. And England basically wanted to control that. So they did that. They colonized India. But again, the East India Company was running into trouble here, and they knew they had to rescue the company before it met disaster. So they came up with several schemes, and one such idea was called the Tea Act. And what this did, and this is noted on the slide here, it lowered taxes, it lowered duties on English tea imported to the colonies. Now, what is the logic here, right? They're lowering duties on English tea. They're lowering taxes. Well, hopefully you could see the relation here in terms of the gaining of revenue. They hoped, Parliament that is, that in lowering the tax on English tea, it would entice the colonials to purchase English tea over other tea, namely, French, right? Because it was cheaper. So this was the economic logic behind the Tea Act. And of course, with the more English tea that was sold to the colonials, they would gain more revenue that way through the sales tax. And again, this is an external tax, obviously. All right, so that's the logic behind it. But what about the colonial response? First of all, most of us, when we hear about, lowering taxes, we are not angry about it. In fact, we're happy about it. But in this case, the colonials, despite the fact that uh, you see a lowering in tax on English tea, you see them infuriated. So that leads to the question, why this colonial response? Why are they condemning the Tea Act when in fact it's leading to prices becoming lower for them specifically? Well, here's the basic colonial mindset once again. The colonials truly believed that they were being picked on, that they were selectively being chosen through the Tea Act to rescue the East India Company. In other words, they felt that they were tasked with this financial burden, and it's disguised, right? It's disguised as a lower tax, but in fact, it's meant to manipulate colonials to buy their tea. This was the English thinking, right? It's conspiratorial, but again, there was a lot of conspiracy theories swirling throughout the colonies at this time. Another stance that the colonials had was this: that if the colonials started purchasing English tea due to the lower duties, what they're doing ultimately is selling out. Um, with the previous exacting of um, taxation before, going back to the Sugar Act in 1763, 10 years earlier, the colonials always held their stance, right? They said, no, you can't tax us, right? It's a violation of our freedom, and so on and so forth. Well, look at this situation. Even though they're lowering duties, the colonials felt like if you were being tricked or manipulated into buying English tea just because it's less expensive, then you are abandoning the patriotic position, so to speak, right? And that is to resist all attempts, particularly economic attempts in form of taxation, of authority to be had over the colonies, right? So again, you're selling out on your principles in that respect. At the same time as the colonials, of course, felt this, that they were being manipulated, right? That their consumer habits are being controlled. And of course, they always enjoyed their economic freedom, right? Freedom of choice, as we call it today, to buy what you want, not to be controlled by the mother country. So, yes, lower taxes, but leading to this revolt. Now, this leads to a famous episode of the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And let me give you a little background on why this happened. The governor at that time, he was actually a royal governor. So, keyword there is royal, meaning that he is an official appointed by Parliament, right, and the king, right? So you had this guy, a royal governor named Hutchinson, and he actually had this vested interest, meaning he had some commercial investments involved in some English tea coming into Boston. And of course, there's the Tea Act that's applied to that tea, that cargo tea coming in, right? Lower duties, right? Now, Hutchinson was fully aware that there were a lot of patriots in Boston. Of course, this is the home of the Sons of Liberty. And he, as the royal governor, actually defied them, right? He knew the possibility existed that if this cargo, this ship containing British tea, whereby he was going to profit from it because he invested in it, if the colonials got word of it, they would not allow that ship to dock, because once the ship docks, you have to pay the tax, right? But Hutchinson defies them. He stands up to them as the royal governor and demands that the ship, it was named the Dartmouth, by the way, that it dock on the port of Boston. And that's what happened. The Dartmouth landed in Boston or docked in Boston, and they still had the tea on board, however. It wasn't unloaded yet. So, some patriots had an idea. Let's go aboard the Dartmouth and let us throw the tea overboard in a display of revolt and defiance against the Tea Act. And that's what happened. They did exactly that. Now, if you really think about what they're doing here, the Patriots, um, what they're doing is something that is a violation of a sacred belief, right? And that's the destruction of private property. And let's also remember that these guys are English. The colonials are still English, right? And they believe in this. They believe that your property cannot be violated. Let's remember, for example, the Stamp Act, right? The Congress, where they felt, taxation was a form of property theft. Or let's remember Dickinson, who said, if we're being taxed without a consent, then it is a violation of our property. We cannot be secure in our property. That's what Dickinson claimed. But now you see the colonials destroying private property. So this is a harsh response. This is actually unprecedented. The colonials, a lot of English persons felt, and even some colonials, to be honest, if you were a colonial that sided with Parliament and the mother country of England and didn't like all this uh, revolt, then you called yourself a loyalist. So some loyalists were in Boston and they disagreed with this as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, the measures that are going to be leveled towards the colonials in response to destruction of property is going to be the first drastic measure undertaken by Parliament. And this is the Coercive Acts of 1774. Now, if you were a colonial, you didn't call it the Coercive Acts. That was the official title when it was issued by Parliament. But if you're a colonial, you called it the Intolerable Acts, right? We are not going to tolerate it, in other words. But Parliament says we're going to coerce you, right, to obey. That's the Coercive Acts. Now, here are 4 measures here. First of all, they closed Boston Harbor. What they did is set up a blockade of English ships to prevent other ships from coming in, with goods to trade. And their logic here was to cripple the Massachusetts economy, right? To put them in an economic stranglehold, so to say, and prevent them from getting the needs that they're used to, and basically make them give up, right? Make them, basically concede to Parliament, right? But by the way, the anticipation by Parliament was that other colonial port cities, let's say Charleston or New York or Philadelphia, would try to take over from Boston as England's most favored port city. Okay, because Boston held that status as the most favored port city when it came to English trade. But that's not what happened. You didn't see other colonial cities say, hey, we'll take over from Boston. Let's start trading and favor us, right? What actually happened was the 13 colonies began to act in a united way. And in fact, what they did is smuggle in the goods that were prevented from coming in due to this, closing of the Boston Harbor, right? So they helped them out. So what I want to emphasize here is the colonies are starting to think in a more united way. And eventually, as we know, we will call the new republic by July 4th, 1776, the United States of America. Now, the second one refers to those royal officials, whether it's a soldier, like during the Boston Massacre, or, royal appointees like Hutchinson. You had some of them tried locally in Boston, but what Parliament said is this can't happen. Anyone accused of a crime who is a royal official has to be tried in England because they felt it would be an unfair trial. Now, if you were a colonial, you didn't call this, the Coercive Act number 2, right? You called it the Murder Act. And there's that flair for propaganda again, or at least rhetoric, right? Just like you called the Stamp Act the Fatal Stamp Act, you called number 2 the Murder Act. Okay, number three, excuse me, is the continuation of the Quarter Act, and we already know why that's controversial, but it continues here. And number four is probably the most symbolic. What you had here is Parliament basically taking away authority and political power from the Massachusetts Charter. And if you recall, the Charter had been around since the establishment of Puritan settlement. It was their political institution. Just like in Virginia, you had the House of Burgesses. And let me remind you again that, with salutary neglect, Parliament did not interfere in the political life of the colonies pretty much. But that was until now. With the coercive acts in response to the Boston Tea Party, you see them taking away local power, at the same time asserting power from England itself. All right, so this is symbolic because, as I mentioned, this institution was around since the beginning and it symbolized political independence. But now you, the Parliament, that is, right, you are telling Bostonians that their institution is no longer a valid one. Okay, so that's the famous coercive acts. And what's going to happen in response is the meeting of the First Continental Congress. And as we'll see, they met in order to sort of coordinate and come to a consensus on what to do in reaction to the coercive acts. But again, the key word there is Continental Congress. You're going to see almost all of the colonies get together and unite themselves. And that's what's very important about it. Many of these guys who met there would be members of what we call our founding fathers.